For those that are joining, this live stream is going to be about holy matrimony from Holy 40.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
we're going to talk about matrimony, marriage, and I'm going to be interviewing and asking questions, and we're going to hear some great responses, hopefully.
Hopefully. Yeah, I'm bound to get one out of, probably the 45 minutes to an hour they're going to be here. One thing that might stick. So hopefully, with God's grace, we'll see what happens.
Yeah. And if you don't mind, I'd like to also incorporate fatherhood too, instead of just like marriage. Is that fine?
Yeah, you can't. I mean, it's. I find it hard pressed to separate the two. I think we have to go to parenting as well because it's the procreation and raising children is just such a big part of the whole thing too. I think it'd be a good thing to do.
And this will be from your perspective, so obviously the husband's perspective. But if you want to add any wife advice or anything from a girl's perspective, just add it in. So
sure, yeah, I'll do the best I can.
Cool. All right, I'll start off with have you seen the definition of marriage change historically, and what it is today?
Yeah, I mean, within the context of Catholicism or within the context of society, because society has changed to the point.
First being like Western society, and then Catholicism, I would say.
Okay. Well, first of all, Western society has completely botched the whole thing because marriage now is no longer between a man and a woman, instituted by society for the sake of procreation and raising holy children. For the sake of society, it's become whatever you want it to be, whoever you want to marry for the sake of quote unquote love, which ultimately turns into using the other person's body for your own disordered pleasure. Because if there's no fruit in the act, and therefore there's no fruit in the act in itself is perverse. So in that sense, I think marriage has lost its understanding. And I think the reason why the West has gone out, society has gone that way, I think it's because the church, I think, has also lost its definition. Because if you could let the absolute truth, if you could let poison kind of seep through the cracks, it's going to affect it to the point where it's just going to get to the roots, unfortunately. And one of the biggest problems that I've seen when it comes to marriage is definition between contract and covenant. Nowadays, you see what I call pop Catholicism speakers, especially those who speak among the youth. They call it a covenant. And the problem you have with that is it takes the whole contract aspect of it, because contrary to popular belief, marriage is not based on love. Marriage is actually based on justice. That's the virtue it's based on. Because you have a justice, a marital act, or you have obligations that you have towards one another that have to be completed. You look at marriage as a contract versus what's called a covenant. And by covenant, what they mean is giving up yourself however you think you can give yourself up. There's no basis to it. It's just giving up yourself. What does that mean? It's the ambiguity is what kills it. So marriage is based on justice, not so much based on the understanding of superficial or love or emotional concepts. And that's where I think it's been changed throughout the last 60, 70 years. And it's caused a great harm because it's no longer the roles that are that men and women should play within the contract of marriage. It's become I have this covenant. I give of myself of how I think I give of myself to you, and then vice versa. That's problematic within the home. So that's how I think it's changed. Is that major change between covenant and contract is probably today.
One of the big changes with marriage is that divorce rates are going high, extremely skyrocketing in our culture.
Absolutely.
How do you think, or could you give a little explanation as to your thoughts on how the hookup culture and how, so like dating a bunch of people, emotional chastity is breaking, physical chastity is breaking, and then not only that, pornography. How is that killing marriage from happening and leading to divorce?
Well, no, that's a good question. I think any addiction, regardless of maybe pornography, alcohol, excessive use, so, vice being the excess and defect. Good old Kentucky bourbon over here. This is my one and only glass for the week. And in moderation, things have to be, consumed. So I think any addiction, regardless if it's pornography, alcoholism, or the hookup culture, whatever it may be, even addicted to the phone, it causes the person's lower faculties to be aroused to such a degree that the will is weakened, that the person no longer understands the natural law to the point where they can't even give themselves up to the other person, to the point where it's using others for their own personal sake. And that's what addiction does. So the problem with pornography, what it does is it consumes the soul to such a degree, the lower faculties are so aroused that the other person becomes an object, as we know. So, and what happens is when you create that atmosphere as you go along as a 8-year-old boy to 13 to 15 to 18, if you don't have the virtue instilled in you, in the intellect, to where you can actually conform yourself to the truth for the sake of the other person, that's not going to go into the marriage. Now, there are some sacramental graces that you get when marriage is long, but the graces are only going to be as efficacious as the soul that's receiving them. So the more prepared the soul is to the grace, the greater the grace is going to be. God can only do so much without breaking the will of the individual. So the problem that we see here is you have unmoderated, first of all, music among teenagers, unmoderated pornography, all the things that go through the will and hit the emotions to the point where it really disorders the faculties of man. And I think if you don't go into marriage having that virtue, just for example, the virtue of benevolence and benignity, these are the two virtues that no one even talks about. The benevolence is knowing what to do for the other person. And benignity is actually acting in the will for the greater good of the other person. And how are you going to fulfill the marital act? How are you going to fulfill the justice if you can't even see yourself to be someone? So for example, let's look at the whole context of marriage. My body, my choice can be used within marriage, and it's going to destroy the marriage. That's what ultimately it is, because the wife has an absolute right for the husband to say to the husband, you have to use your body to go out and to earn a living so I can be at home and raise the children. Now, in today's culture, it might be necessary only in grave matters, for the wife to go out and work, but in grave matters, but in a natural order, you want the husband to go out. So the husband could just say, no, that's my body and my choice. I just want to work part-time. I don't want to work full-time to raise a family. So if you don't have that virtue within you to say, listen, I'm going to do whatever it takes for the sake of the other person, that's going to, create this divorce culture. And the other problem is this whole Disney idea of soulmate, the soulmate garbage. And because what does the whole soulmate do? It's problematic, because what it does is it tells the person there's someone out there that's God made just for me. And that becomes problematic, because what happens is as soon as you fall in love with someone, and nowadays that means an emotional connection, and once that fades, you start to say to yourself, maybe that person wasn't the one that God intended for me. Let me leave them and go to someone else. That's a huge problem. And this is the whole covenant problem with it versus contract. You enter a contract within marriage, and within that contract, the whole point of the contract is that you're saying to yourself that there's two aspects to marriage. There's a natural level and there's a supernatural level. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But the natural level is the fact that, listen, this is an institution that we've joined together for the sake of society. We're going to have children. We're going to be open to children immediately, and we're going to raise them in holiness because we want them in heaven too. Because that's the whole point of having children, is you want as many as possible so you can glorify God in heaven. So the pornography, the hookup culture, all of that, what it's doing is just creating it's just exasperating the natural sin, right? Original sin, which is doing what I want to do versus doing what God wants me to do. So I think that's the whole problem.
You started to answer my next question a little bit in terms of that soulmate question, but
sure.
So what happens when you're in the honeymoon, you have the butterflies, you have all the emotion, consolation, and then marriage gets real smack. It's tough, and the same thing happens in the spiritual life. We see when people have the consolations, and then as soon as they get aridity, desolation, they turn their back on God, and they abandon God, they quit, and people are doing that with marriage. How do you overcome? Obviously, you're a married man, so you have previous experience, but
sure.
How do you overcome that, or how do you go about that? Once that desolation hits.
In principle, that is something. As you said, when desolation hits, you just got to continue. Why? Because when you said "I do" to the person, that "I do" is for better and for worse. Of course, the vows that we make. And the thing about consolation and desolation is love is not even proven until it starts hurting. Love is not even proven until there's desolation there, because you can't prove to God that you love him in the moment of consolation, because it's irresistible. Like the Council of Trent says, God's grace is irresistible. But if it's irresistible, how do we resist it? And it's irresistible in the beatific vision. But here on earth, it can be resisted. And I think that there's a sense of desolation which elevates you to the greater good, which is willing to love with the other person regardless of how you feel. Listen, if you're going to get married, you better take yourself out of the situation. It's got to be, even to the point. Just the other last month, I was sitting, I was with Father R, and I was telling him about vacations among marriages, and he looked at me and he laughed and he said, "Listen, if you're going to have children, you can kiss vacations goodbye." And you just, unless you're taking them with you, and it's prudent, you can leaving your kids someone else, and you going off on this, you can kiss that goodbye. If you don't have the virtue of willing the greater good of the other person, regardless of how you feel, if you don't have the virtue of charity, which is seeing the glory of God in that person, loving that person because of God, then you better work on some real stuff before marriage is long. This ain't for you. Listen, this is not something to play with. This is not just something that you get together with someone and sign a contract because you have feelings for them. That's going to go away. If you don't have that virtue of loving them, even in the moment of absolute dryness, then it's not real love. That's what real love is. So,
there was a good question in the comments that I saw that is a follow-up to this. So you're in that desolation, right? What if one of the spouses becomes abusive, or it's becoming very not a virtuous relationship, or they're abusing them, whether it's physically or spiritually or emotionally? How do you go about that? And is trying to get an annulment the answer?
No, that's a great question. I think a lot of times you see. Let me go back a little bit to answer that question, because it's not a black or white question or answer, because we have to go back to this. The whole point of courtship is to find out how much virtue the person has in relationship to you. That's the whole point of courtship, right? So you spend time with the person in a group, because you want to see what kind of person he is in relationship to other people as well. And you want to spend time with that person within their family to see what relationship, what he has. For example, if you're a girl and he's got sisters, you want to see how he treats his mom and his sister, because if he treats his mom and his sister like dump, then who are you, right? Who are you to him if his mother is elevated to that situation? So the whole point of courtship, this is why I've been against, in a way, not all the time, but this is why I've been against, in a way, this long distance relationships. Because it's hard for you to look at the person if they're not there physically. How do you know the person has any virtue of chastity in relationship to you if he's not there physically? to say no to that situation. You know what I'm saying? So if forget this whole idea of you trying to fix someone who's already abusive. You know what I'm saying? The person does not have virtue when it comes to growing in the virtue of, charity and chastity and meekness and all of these other virtues. Then you're asking for it later on, because when marriage comes along, people end up getting a little bit more comfortable with one another. All right, and that comfortability, the bad side starts to come out. All right, and what the major point of marriage is that you take two souls that are so different and imperfect, right? And then the other person's imperfections become the sanctification process of your perfection, and that's the whole point of that perfection within marriage. And if that person's imperfections are to the point where it's just going to make marriage absolutely miserable, then you're just going to have to walk away and pray that person grows to the point where they have virtue before you walk in. So if you know that the person is going to be abusive before marriage and you marry them anyway, then you should have had a little bit more, virtue of understanding of like, listen, this is not, you should let the feeling, the emotions out of the way and be like, listen, he's not good for me. What's going to happen between me and my children and all that stuff, this is going to be a nightmare. But after marriage, let's say a person changes, throughout the years, the person becomes more abusive because of stress or whatever it may be throughout the world and depression, things like that, and they're taking out on the spouse, and that there's a failure. They did not draw from the graces of the sacrament properly. Then the only advice that I could give is literally to seek a spiritual director for that person and see what's going on. And in that case, and then an annulment is only going to be necessary or good or efficacious if the marriage, had any problems before it started.
It was never a marriage in the first place.
It was never a marriage in the first place. Yeah, you have a cake sitting in the oven for 10 years without two main ingredients, and it can sit there for 10 years. It doesn't make a cake. So that's the whole point of it, the annulment. It's not going to solve the problem. Sometimes it's necessary because in today's culture, people get married, they have no idea what they're getting themselves into. Yeah. So this is the problem. I think the church, in my personal opinion, has failed in this. And this is where the whole covenant contract problem is coming. And I think that a lot of stuff, that the whole covenant stuff came from Ronner. He introduced a lot of that stuff with the marriage and relationship to one another. And if you look at the old way of looking at marriage, it's like, listen, I have virtue, I'm trying to go in virtue. You're trying to go in virtue. My whole point is to get to heaven. Your whole point is to get to heaven. Let's get together, have a bunch of children, raise them for the sake of heaven, to get to heaven together. I mean, it's as simple as that. You find someone who wants to do that, so marriage is going to last forever.
Just that easy. Yeah.
It's that easy. Yeah.
Father Orr says, I don't care if you put a bag on her head.
What is that one song? If you want to be happy for the rest of your life, never make a pretty woman your wife. It's an old song, but yeah. If you have to put a bag over her head, it doesn't matter. If she has virtue, you're going to have a wonderful life with her, because she's always going to look out for you and for your sake and get the emotions, and you do the same thing. Yeah. If charity is still in the soul, and these graces that you get within the sacrament of marriage, and if you just get the emotions out of the way, I mean, yeah, if they're there, that's great. Use them for the sake to draw yourself to your wife. This is my biggest problem that I have within marriage at the moment. I have a healthy, natural attachment to my wife, right? But even that attachment to my wife needs to be moderated to the point, because I can never help her through her situations or through her problems if I'm emotionally attached, because I'm going to be affected by the reaction that she's going to give me. But if I can remove myself from that attachment, I can look at outside of myself and get myself outside of it and say, okay, what do I need to do to help this person versus how am I going to react to their reaction? So there needs to be a lot of charity there.
Yeah, it's hard to look at objectively to help her.
Correct. Yeah, it's always going to be, how am I going to react to this, emotionally react to this? And it becomes a problem. So it's training yourself in virtue, and you can never start too early. This is where the parenting comes in. This is the problem. Parenting is arduous work, man.
It's a lifetime of work.
Yeah, no, it's never ending. It really is. It's constantly. But you know what? There is nothing like fatherhood. You know, real manhood. The process of real manhood, I think, a lot of times is fatherhood.
Yeah, we see a lot in our culture, men not fulfilling their role as fathers, and if they are doing that, they're doing it very effeminately, like they're watching television all the time. They're not with their kids, and their daughters are growing up and rebelling in a very unchaste way, and their sons are rebelling in an unchaste way as well, or whatever.
Sure.
How do you be that virtuous father, and what are some practical things that you can do to be that father and not go through the motions and just really watch your family fall apart like almost all the fathers out there in the secular world that aren't striving for virtue right
now? No, that's the fundamental issue of society today is lack of fatherhood. Fundamental as a feminine man. Fundamental issue. You fix that. That's the root, the absolute root. So I refer everyone to Saint Alphonsus. He wrote a little. I think it was a homily or a little pamphlet on parenthood. I'd like to refer everyone to that. Look it up in Google. The reason I refer to that is because he says something that is extremely important. He says if you're a father full of vices, your children are going to be full of vices. It's just the way it is, and especially through what's called generational spirits. Your kids are going to be worse than you are if you don't get some of these generational spirits out of your family. So I'm going to give maybe 3 things on how to combat that. Number 1, I don't care how old you are. If you have not conquered prayer, the love of prayer, it's over. And you were talking about this the other day. You were talking about the levels of prayer.
Yes.
And St. Augustine says, "He who does not does not conquer mental prayer cannot be saved." And it's absolutely true. So prayer is number 1, because if you can't bring that virtue or that virtue of prayer into your family, that habit of prayer into your family, you don't expect to flip the light on once you get married, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, I got this extraordinary grace, and it happens sometimes, but it's very rare. This extraordinary grace, I'm going to start praying the rosary on a daily basis and going on adoration once a week, or doing a holy hour for the sake of my family. So here's what I think needs to happen on the natural level. Number 1, there needs to be arduous work as a young man growing up. And the reason that is because if you can build that virtue, you can take that virtue into your family, right?
Yes.
And children are arduous work. They are absolute arduous work. And if you seek comfort, and this is the biggest problem with our society, if you seek comfort as the end all be all, most people, they work for the sake of comfort, which I have something to say about finances in just a second, because we are in a world of hurt. But if we are working for the sake of comfort, right, then everything around us is going to be for the sake of that comfort. We're going to use everything for the sake of comfort. This is the biggest problem that we have. And the problem with parenthood nowadays is I'm going to give my children whatever they want. And the worst thing that you could say as a parent is this word. And people say this all the time. They say this: I want to give my children what I didn't have. Well, I'm sorry. I didn't know what you didn't have was necessary for their sanctification. How do you know that? Your job is not to fulfill them with garbage they can play with all day long, so that you can fulfill the natural sense of fatherhood, and to pat yourself in the back because you made a bunch of money and then you give a bunch of toys. No. The whole point, when the church says that parenting is procreation and education of children, the education isn't just math; it's virtue, right? And what you have done in this case is if you don't have the virtue necessary to give to your children and to raise your children that virtue, you have burdened society, because what you've done is you've lacked the virtue, the arduous work that was injustice necessary for you to accomplish for the sake of your family, sake of children. You have raised effeminate men, and then you sent them out to society, and now we got to deal with them because you didn't do your job.
Mm.
You see what I'm saying? And this is the problem, that we have this chain reaction of a fatherhood of not dealing properly with their children, raising effeminate men. They're out in society, and now we got to deal with them, right? So there needs to be. So that's number one. Number two. So we talked about prayer, fasting, and fasting without anyone knowing.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? So just literally, like, I'm not talking about start with the smallest things. I'm not talking about just going down to one meal a day for the sake of your children. If you want to build up to that, do that.
No snack.
I'm talking about simply just this. Right? This is my biggest problem. Right? I got a sweet tooth. Right? I love to have a piece of dark chocolate after dinner. Okay, and my body has gotten accustomed to that. I have dinner, and it's like my body's like, oh, I want that chocolate. Just denying myself that dark chocolate, I can offer that denial up for the sake of my children's sanctification. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So just be the nice letting go of that. So fatherhood is extremely important, because through fatherhood, and look at St. Joseph as an example. I mean, I will say this: the man was a beast when it comes to internal discipline. You literally were married to the most gorgeous creature, the most gorgeous woman in the history of all humanity, someone who wasn't even tainted with original sin, and you couldn't touch her in that way. Right? Talk about chastity to the nth degree, right? Mm-hmm. And if you don't have that virtue within you, it's going to be a problem, because you're always going to use your wife as an object. And I always say this I always teach confirmation. I say this to the girls. If he can't keep his hands off of you right now, how do you expect him to keep his hands off of someone else when he can't have you within marriage? Because chastity within marriage is very important. So as a father, prayer, fasting, and arduous work, and being diligent and vigilant of my children's faults. And if you don't mind, I'd like to give one more thing before you move on to the next one. One more thing. The greatest advice I ever received from parenthood was through a priest. People always say, if you're going to get advice on parenthood, is it from a priest or for a couple? I'd go to a priest all day long, twice on Sunday, every day. Why? Because the couple's going to give me their experience on how to raise children. The priest is going to give me something that's objective in principle, according to the church, right? So that's what I want. I want someone to give me something objective and in principle, so I can apply it. I can direct my will towards it and apply it. What he said was this. He said, look, you want to find out the temperament of your child, and then you want to find out what natural faults that temperament brings on. And then you want to find out, well, at what age do these faults come on, right? So I have a 5-year-old child, right? I had to make sure at the age of 5, he did not have 4-year-old vices and tendencies of imperfection. When he turned 6, I had to spend the entire year when he was 5 to make sure that when he's 6 years old, he acts like a 6-year-old. When he's 7, he's actually 7. So by the time they're 18, they're an actual adult, not only in age, but also in virtue. So if I went ahead and allowed him to continue on a life of vice by just giving him whatever we want and fulfilling his lower faculties, the problem I'm going to get, the problem it's going to have is this, is the fact that you're going to get to a point where when they're 18, they're going to have the emotional capacity of an 8-year-old. Mm-hmm. And one of the biggest issues that we've seen is, and I asked Father Rippiger just when I was sitting with him, I said, what's the point? I go, what's going on with all these men? He said, here's the problem. And it's how we talked. He goes, here's the problem. So,
essentially, good.
Yeah. So he said, He literally said to me, he goes, here's the problem. He says, a lot of times when a child faces what's called a subconscious disassociation from the father, if there's a traumatic moment that happens to the child's life, the child becomes stuck at that emotional age, no matter how old he gets, right? And what is the one thing that causes a child to have that traumatic life? Its parents, and especially its fatherhood. This is why it's important for you to give your children an innocent upbringing, to make sure that the appropriate age, you're administering the virtues at an appropriate age. You don't want to give too much or too little. And the last thing I'm going to say is this: the sacraments. There is no way in Hades that any of you, as a Catholic, we cannot enter into an institutional civil marriage. As Catholics, we have to enter into sacramental marriage, right? Because in the beginning, when God created Adam and Eve, it was institutional, right? It was a natural marriage. It wasn't until Christ came along and made the sacramental. And this is why at the wedding of Cana, it's a beautiful image. Jesus changed water into wine. And the steward said, they usually save the worst wine after everyone's drunk. They save the worst wine last. When everyone's drunk, they don't even notice. And think about this. When is marriage, according to society, its sweetest? The beginning. Right?
Yeah.
So the beginning, right? And when Christ changed that water to wine, it was the best wine they've ever had. Right? But it was towards the end. Sacramental marriage only gets better as you get older.
Wow.
See what I'm saying?
Yeah.
This was the sweet wine, was towards the end. This was the sweetness of marriage. And with Christ and through Christ, marriage only gets better as you get toward, as it gets going. Not the very beginning. And this is where you gotta get rid of the emotional aspect of it. And you just go, listen, I want what's best for this person, and I'm going to fulfill the natural law. I'm going to fulfill injustice for the sake of this person. I'm going to love them for the sake of them. So, yeah, I hope I didn't say too much there.
That's a really good analogy. Wow.
Yeah, it's a beautiful analogy. I heard it from I heard it in a homily, just at a Sunday mass from a fraternity priest, and I was just blown away from it. I was like, beautiful, beautiful analogy.
So there's a lot of talks about marriage, a lot of things. I mean, you've probably been to a lot of them, and I know I've been to a lot of them, and they all kind of have the same idea, and all about marriage and discernment and vocations. And when people are attending these talks, what advice do you have for people to look out for, or what types of false concepts are these talks sharing? Because they are people giving their own personal experience and are not necessarily looking at it objectively. One that you said, covenant versus contract. Are there any other ones that we should be looking out for, because there are a million marriage talks that you can attend or watch on YouTube?
Sure. I would look out for specifically the ones that treat NFP as if it's a contraception that Catholics can accept.
Yes.
And I don't think NFP should be taught till after marriage. That's my, especially in today's world. You're taking two unchaste individuals, you stick them in a room, and you talk about acts that involve the sixth and last commandment, and you don't expect them to walk out with any relationship to that. It's a problem. And NFP nowadays is being taught as if it's a natural contraceptive. Oh, you want to listen? First of all, biggest problem that I have is this: anyone who accepts, any couple who says before marriage, we want to wait a couple of years after we're married before we have children,
then they shouldn't get married.
You're not ready. You are not ready to get married. You have no idea what you're doing. No idea what you're doing. You know what I'm saying? You're absolutely right. You just said to the person that
you're not married until you consummate, but also you're not married if you don't want to have children. So when people say like, I have no intention of having children, maybe in the future, that's an annulment right there. Like,
it becomes illicit.
Yeah.
Absolutely illicit. Yeah. According to canon law, you're right. It's absolutely illicit. The act in itself, because the point of the act. See, union. There's three aspects to marriage. The first of all is the procreation and unitive act. That's the number one thing. You have children, and you be open to children, right? You be open to having children as much as you possibly can. And there's going to be a natural, a natural distance between the first child and the second child, right? So you have to be open to children always. Because here's the thing: what's the point of anything in life? What's the end? Right? There are ends of a specific thing that you are performing for in the natural law. You know what I'm saying? There are ends. So God has created human beings to such a degree to where if we are not living within the natural law or the divine law, we're going to face the natural consequences of this, right? So what is the ultimate end of every action that we commit? It's heaven, right? So the whole purpose of having children, they're not mine. My children are not mine. You know, they belong to God. I've just been entrusted to let them know that there's a crown waiting for them in heaven, like Fulton Sheen says. And woe to those parents who don't tell the children about that crown, right? So that's just the whole point. So the whole point of marriage is you are entering this contract with this person, and in the marital, fulfilling the marital debt is when you're committing that act, the conjugal act between the two, it must end to its proper end, with the natural end, which is what? Procreation and unity. Okay, first procreation. And the whole point of procreation first, then unity. The second aspect of marriage is mutual unitive. It's not emotional love. And the reason is because emotional love has nothing to do with it if you are not fulfilling the contract in which you are doing whatever it takes to get this other person to heaven. And that's where the unitive comes from. It comes into. The third aspect is then you got the whole emotional and all that stuff. It's like the three faculties of man. The lowest faculty is the emotions, right? You know, the intellect is the highest, and the will is the second. So it's having. This is the thing. This is where I think the church has failed. This is where I think marriage talks have failed. If you are not giving someone in the intellect the true concept of what marriage is supposed to be, and if you are not, if you don't, let's say you know it, knowing it is one thing. If you don't have the disposition and the will in order for you to actually do it, it's just knowledge for knowledge's sake. This is why I always say, theology without the action of the act for holiness is theology. It's philosophy. I'm learning it. It's called intellectual effeminacy, right? I'm learning for the. So the end of everything is the end of marriage is heaven. It's sanctification for the sake of heaven. You want heaven for your spouse, and you want and vice versa. If that is not the goal, if the transcendent third is not Christ, it's over before it even started. Because your common, interests. Listen, you and I both know, as we get older, the things that we end up liking and the stuff that, my taste of music nowadays is pretty different than my taste of music that was before, right? And if me and my wife had nothing but a taste of music and taste of food and the same taste of movies, and that's what was the bond of our marriage, once those things start to change, you start saying, hey, you changed. You're the same person you used to be. Well, duh, I'm supposed to change.
Yeah.
I'm supposed to grow. And if that was the basis of our relationship, then it's over before it even started.
Yeah.
So that's that. Finances. Can I talk about finances real quick?
Yeah, yeah.
we are in a world of mess as far as the culture goes. And I'll tell you what. What is our money backed up with?
This.
Nothing.
Air. Paper.
It's notes written by the Federal Reserve that charges interest, and we end up paying for it, right? See, the problem is everything is connected. Everything is connected. We can't look at the problem with pornography, the problem with marriage, the problem with society, and not see the fruits of that problem and everywhere else. The reason why I made the move from California to Kentucky was because I want a self-sufficient, sustaining culture, agriculture here, to where it's sustaining my family without me going to the grocery store and relying on society. The problem is we have literally given ourselves up to government and to ourselves up to society to the point where we've relied on the system that is eventually going to break. And we have a effeminate man who can't even pour a bowl of cereal, let alone, start, go out hunting for the sake of their family and learn to do that, because it's going to come to a point.
Yeah.
I don't think that there is any way for us to save the system that we've started. I think we're doomed. I think it's over. Because in America, and I love this country, in America, we live like a first world country, but in reality, we're a third world country.
Yeah.
Because we used to be the biggest creditors in the world. The world used to owe us a lot of money when money was backed up by gold. Now we're the biggest debtors to the world. You know what I'm saying? We owe the world so much.
Yep.
And if we continue to keep borrowing to live a certain lifestyle, we can keep printing as much money as we want to and keep kicking the can down the road. Eventually, the day of reckoning is going to come. And when that comes, it's going to be a world of hurt, right?
Yeah.
If you do not have the virtue to say no to the things that you don't need, and I can't tell you how much I said this out. As a father and as a husband, how you spend your money shows you what virtues you have in other areas. Because if you're going to continue to borrow to continue a certain lifestyle that you want, that's effeminacy. Because you're seeking pleasure and comfort versus the arduous work of actually waiting. If something costs $5,000, well, I can just finance it. How about you save as much money as you can to the point until you get to that money and then you purchase it? It's delayed gratification.
Yep.
If you haven't learned that, then this is going to be a problem. And this is the society that we've gone into. We've gotten in such a mess. When the day of reckoning comes, we have such effeminate men. Forget fatherhood, within the homes. Just in society alone, it's going to be a problem. And the real men are going to survive, and the effeminate are not.
Yeah, they're going to have the food, the self-sustainability, the land.
Right. Yeah.
Back to the Catholic land movements developed by Bell, Chesterton.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah. And
so that's the thing about marriage is you have to look into it. You and your spouse have to look at it and say, hey, are we on the same page of this? Because when I went to when I went to the marriage conferences when I got married to the diocese, the two things that they taught: how to balance a budget artificially, and how to use NFP correctly.
That's that. How to live an effeminate lifestyle and how to use contraception to support that.
Yep. How to be selfish.
And that's I was trying to get into, hoping that you would say things like that, because you go to these talks and why is this marriage talk different than those talks, this live stream?
No, it's true. It's pretty much how to enable your the natural sin, the natural, the first sin of our parents, original sin. How to enable it? How to continue to enable it? This is a bigger problem, and I think the church needs to get back to solid catechesis and stop worrying about offending people. Yeah. If the person is offended by the truth, that's their problem.
They're already
right. The whole point. They already got the whole point of life is finding the truth and conforming yourself to it. If you can't conform yourself to it, you're going to twist it according to your own interpretation, and then you're going to distort it. The natural consequences, you're going to suffer.
Yeah.
Right? Conform yourself to it. If you don't have the virtue to do that, then you're going to suffer. Right? Stop worrying about offending people. Just give them the truth. Eventually, they're going to see that living a life according to natural laws or divine law, this is what's going to bring happiness. All right? St. Thomas said this. He talked about, what brings happiness. He goes, well, is money the source of happiness? No, because you have to give it away to get something. So it cannot be the source of happiness in itself. If you have to give it away, it's not the source of happiness. And he talked about, well, is fame the source of happiness? He says, no, because look at the celebrities, even during his time, people who were, he says, they live a lifestyle that is feeding of the passions. The passions can't be satisfied. It's the father under the will, right? So so that's the only way to satisfy it. So let's look at history. Look at every single saint who only person they're concerned with is two things. Number one, their families. I'm talking about saints who are, for the sake of their families. Who just had the feast day the other day was yeah, that's right. Their whole point was to raise their children to become saints.
They did.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah. So and then they became saints themselves.
Yep.
And here's my last advice when it comes to this thing. When it comes to marriage, learn to love God first. It took me a long time to get to this point, just to share something personal. It was a long time to get to this point. Every single time I'm tempted now, it's become a little bit easier for me to say no to it, because I literally start to remind myself, why would I want to offend God? Is this worth it? Not, is it worth it for me to go to hell? Not, do I really want to offend him?
Compunction.
Why would I want? Yeah, yes, absolutely. Why would I want to do that?
Perfect.
Right? Exactly. And I think if we don't have that attitude or strive towards that attitude, it's going to be a problem when it comes to temptation. Because for the sake of my family, why do I want to raise my children to get to heaven? Because I love God. Because I want to see as many people, in the front in the kingdom, worshiping Him as much for all of eternity in the beatific vision. That's the whole point why He gave them to me, right? And that burning love, that zeal, that charity, that needs to grow, and only through prayer does that grow. It makes it easier for you to say no. And there's this probably just the natural sense of it. There's this immense just gratitude. It's just absolute. When you actually do something for the sake of someone that you love, it brings you closer to that person.
Mm-hmm.
And there is I cannot find an act in my life, in my personal life. I cannot find a single act in my personal life that draws me closer to God than me saying no to a temptation because I'm doing it for Him.
Amen.
It doesn't matter how much I want it. It doesn't matter how intense the feeling is. It doesn't matter the destination I'm in. If I'm going to will myself to do the greater good for His sake, it brings me closer to Him.
Mm.
There's nothing greater than that, in my personal opinion. And some of the things.
Yeah. I mean, every sin is stemmed out of pride, because we think we're God. Right. And we can decide what we want to do at that time. But if you do something for God, you're recognizing the truth, which is you're below God, and that's truth. And by recognizing that, that's an act of humility, because humility is conforming yourself to the truth, and that's really ultimately what we can do. I once heard very good advice from a guy that's married, and he said, "You don't marry who you love. You love who you married."
That's beautiful. That's awesome.
And that was really good advice. So we're almost here at an hour, and so I wanted to close with one objection that people have towards marriage sometimes. What happens if you can't have kids? Because that's a common thing that I hear when people say, "I'm married. We physically can't have kids. are we supposed to adopt? Do we just live out like a justified marriage, or
Sure.
So that's like an objection I guess we could finish with.
Sure.
That could just somebody in their minds like, oh, I can just null and void their whole conversation.
Sure. Well, here's the thing. The only person who cannot get married is someone who has been what's called impotent or castrated.
A eunuch, yes.
A eunuch. There's no absolute. There's no way of consummation. So that's the only person who cannot get married. If you are unable to have children, it doesn't matter, because in principle, the act in itself, you are open to life, right? And there might be a miracle there. I mean, we saw it with Abraham.
Yes.
So as long as you're open to life, and in principle, that action in itself is open to life, regardless if you can physically have a child or not. The consummation of the marriage, the openness to life, the marriage is valid, the marriage is beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
And if you really want kids, there's a lot of kids out there who are abandoned.
Yes.
Who need a family? Who need a solid family who's going to baptize them and raise them to get to heaven. So that's pretty much my answer.
Very good answer to
that. I've come to find when you give the church's answer, the wisdom that the church has had throughout 2,000 years. People don't know this, but the church actually is an expert in the human behavior. The Catholic Church is, because she understands how humanity works, because it's been revealed to her by God.
Yes.
And this is why St. Thomas is so crucial, because he looks at the individual according to how they were made, and is able to show how an individual can be, to grow in holiness and sanctification through the faculties.
Yes.
This is why modern psychiatry and psychology doesn't really work, because it robs from the personhood. When you take the personhood away, when you take the person away, and the person has just been reduced to, the Darwinistic nothing. Yeah, you can't help the person.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the biggest thing. So the church, when you give the answer according to the church, it makes perfect sense. And if the person lives according to that truth, they're going to live a life of a fruitful life. Yeah. Suffer, you will, and thank God that you're suffering, because this is the way that you are growing sanctification. Without suffering, there's no cross, there's no crown.
Yep.
Suffering, yeah. Don't go afflicting yourself. Yeah. Don't go afflicting yourself with something unless your spiritual director says it's necessary. But accept the crosses that God is sending you. And I get these people sometimes, and I'll end with this. It cracks me up, because the new wave of manhood is nowadays. I think you have this pendulum, right? You've got manhood, which completely went down to the other way, become effeminate. And nowadays, the way that people are bringing back manhood is the appearance of manhood, but not interior manhood.
Yeah.
Right. So it's got this whole idea of, you see it all the time. Your spouse needs you to do the dishes because you've come home from work and your spouse has been running around with the kids. And every duty within the household is a man's duty.
It is.
All right. It's not the woman's duty. It's your duty. So you come home and the dishes need to get done, right? But nowadays, what manhood is you tell God, no, I don't want to do the dishes. I want you to accept the 10 deadlifts I'm going to do for you. That's not manhood.
Yep.
You doing the dishes for the sake of your spouse and the state of your life that you are right now for the sake of your family is infinitely more manly than you doing 10 deadlifts for God.
Yeah, exactly.
Because what you're saying is, I'm going to tell you what the sanctification process for my life is, and you're going to accept it, regardless of what you want me to do. That's not manhood. So I'm getting kind of tired of this over. It's like manhood is all about lifting weights and doing this and doing arduous stuff. No, lift up, pull up your sleeves, take your hand in the dishes, do the dishes. That is way more manly than you doing deadlifts.
Exactly.
So that's my thing. Interior discipline is greater than exterior discipline.
Well, thank you for answering all these questions. I know we could probably talk for like 6 hours, so that's...
Yeah, we probably could. Yeah, maybe when you come out, we'll talk for a long time after we build a chapel like the lilies of the field.
Oh yeah, I'll have to bring my pipe.
Thanks again, bud. God bless you.
God bless.
Yeah.